The afternoon sun over Chicago on May 25, 1979 was warm and hazy, the kind of late spring day that promised the start of summer. At O'Hare International Airport, the world's busiest airport at the time, everything seemed normal. Runways buzzed with the sound of jet engines, passengers hurried through terminals, and airline staff kept up the rhythm of countless departures and arrivals. Among them was American Airlines Flight 191, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, preparing for its journey west to Los Angeles. For the 258 passengers and 13 crew members, it was supposed to be an ordinary flight. Business trips, vacations, family reunions, and a few tourists looking forward to California sunshine. None of them knew that within minutes of takeoff, the flight would become the deadliest single aircraft accident in American history. The DC-10 stood on the tarmac, gleaming in American Airlines' polished aluminum livery. The wide-body jet was considered one of the modern marvels of commercial aviation in the 1970s. Its 3 engines gave it a sleek and powerful look, and airlines favored it for its ability to carry hundreds of passengers across long distances efficiently. At the controls in the cockpit that afternoon were Captain Walter Lux, First Officer James Dillard, and Flight Engineer Alfred Udovich. Captain Lux was highly experienced, with over 22,000 flight hours, including thousands on the DC-10. His calm demeanor and steady reputation made passengers unknowingly safer every time they stepped onto one of his flights. Dillard and Udovich were also seasoned professionals. Together, the crew represented the best of what American Airlines could offer in terms of skill and experience. Boarding was smooth. Families settled in. Business travelers stowed briefcases, and flight attendants moved through the aisles with their practiced smiles, making sure everyone was ready for departure. In the cabin, there was the familiar mix of excitement and routine. Children pressing their faces to the windows, first-time flyers gripping their armrests a little tighter, and frequent flyers opening newspapers as though this was just another day in the air. The engines roared to life, and the DC-10 pushed back from the gate, taxiing toward runway 32R. At 3:02 p.m., Flight 191 was cleared for takeoff. The pilots advanced the throttles, and the 3 engines unleashed a wave of thunder that vibrated through the fuselage. The DC-10 gathered speed rapidly, racing down the runway. Passengers felt the pressure pushing them back into their seats, a sensation that was both thrilling and routine. For a moment, everything felt perfectly normal. At 3:04 p.m., the massive jet rotated gracefully and lifted off the ground, its wheels tucking away beneath the wings as it began to climb. But within seconds of leaving the runway, disaster struck. Unknown to the crew or passengers, a fatal weakness had been hidden in the aircraft's left engine mount, a weakness created not by design, but by improper maintenance procedures weeks earlier. As the jet strained upward, the entire left engine, engine number 1, separated from the wing, ripping away in a violent motion. It didn't just fall away cleanly. It tore with it critical hydraulic lines, electrical wiring, and damaged sections of the wing's leading edge. From the ground, stunned witnesses saw the horrifying sight. The DC-10 climbing with smoke and debris trailing from its left wing, the missing engine tumbling across the airfield. Some thought the engine had exploded. Others feared the jet might never gain altitude. Inside the cockpit, alarms blared and warning lights lit up, but the crew was overwhelmed with conflicting information. The sudden loss of the engine itself wasn't the biggest problem. The DC-10 was designed to fly with 2 engines, but the damage to the wing's hydraulics and slats created an aerodynamic imbalance no pilot could have foreseen. As the jet climbed past 300 feet, it began an uncommanded roll to the left. Captain Lux and First Officer Dillard fought desperately with the controls, trying to correct the banking. They pushed the yoke, adjusted rudder, but nothing responded as expected. Unbeknownst to them, the hydraulic damage meant that the left wing slats had retracted, while the right wing slats remained extended. The result was catastrophic. One wing generating more lift than the other, the aircraft's balance destroyed. Passengers felt the plane lurch sharply. Some cried out, others clutched armrests, and the cabin filled with confusion. In the last seconds, the left bank grew steeper and steeper, the nose pitched downward, and the DC-10 seemed to hang helplessly in the sky. Witnesses on the ground later recalled seeing the plane roll almost completely sideways before it nosedived. At 3:04:05 p.m., barely 31 seconds after liftoff, Flight 191 slammed into an open field near a trailer park just beyond O'Hare. The impact was devastating. creating a massive fireball visible for miles. Black smoke billowed into the sky as rescue crews rushed toward the scene, but it was already too late. The crash killed all 271 souls on board instantly, along with 2 more people on the ground. The scene was described as apocalyptic. Firefighters arriving within minutes faced towering flames, intense heat, and wreckage scattered across the field. Pieces of fuselage were barely recognizable, luggage and personal belongings burned among twisted metal, and the devastation left no survivors. For families waiting at Los Angeles, the news came in fragments at first, but soon the reality sank in. Their loved ones would never arrive. In a matter of seconds, Flight 191 had become the worst aviation disaster in U.S. history. The shockwaves spread through Chicago, through the entire nation, and around the world. How could a modern jetliner, flown by an experienced crew, simply fall from the sky moments after takeoff? What had gone so catastrophically wrong? The answers would take months to uncover and would expose flaws not just in the aircraft itself, but in the very systems meant to ensure its safety. In the days following the crash of Flight 191, grief swept across the nation. Chicago, where the disaster unfolded, became the center of mourning. Families gathered in hotels and makeshift support centers near O'Hare Airport, clinging to the faintest hope until authorities confirmed the grim reality. Every passenger and crew member on board had perished. Newspapers carried images of twisted wreckage and grieving relatives, and television anchors struggled to convey the sheer scale of the tragedy. The United States had never seen a single aircraft accident of this magnitude. The questions began immediately. How could a jet as advanced as the DC-10, flown by a highly trained crew, fall from the sky less than a minute after takeoff? Was it mechanical failure, sabotage, pilot error? The National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, moved quickly to begin its investigation, and soon the world would learn that the roots of the disaster stretched far deeper than anyone expected. Investigators first turned their attention to the missing left engine, which had torn away from the wing during takeoff. Wreckage crews combed the airport grounds and surrounding areas, eventually locating the engine pylon and pieces of the assembly. What they found was telling. The engine had not exploded, but rather separated cleanly from its mount, as if ripped away by immense force. The damage to the pylon fitting suggested something more than just bad luck. The NTSB examined maintenance records and discovered that the aircraft had undergone recent work on its engines. Like all DC-10s, Flight 191's engines occasionally needed to be removed for servicing. McDonnell Douglas, the manufacturer, had issued procedures that required each engine to be detached separately using specialized equipment, but American Airlines had adopted a shortcut. To save time, mechanics had been instructed to remove the engine and its heavy pylon assembly together using a forklift to support the weight while the mountings were disconnected. On paper, it saved hours of work. In practice, it created a deadly risk. Investigators realized that during this shortcut procedure, even the smallest misalignment of the forklift could place tremendous stress on the pylon's attach fittings. Over time, that stress could crack or weaken the metal. At O'Hare, mechanics had in fact damaged the left engine pylon weeks earlier during maintenance. The crack went unnoticed, hidden from routine inspection. On May 25th, under the immense forces of takeoff, the weakened mount failed completely, sending the engine tearing off the wing. But why had the loss of one engine caused the aircraft to crash so violently? After all, the DC-10 was designed to fly safely on 2 engines. Here, the investigation uncovered another deadly chain of events. When the engine separated, it tore through hydraulic lines and electrical wiring critical to the wing's operation. This unexpected damage caused the left wing's leading-edge slats to retract, while the right wings remained extended. In effect, one wing was configured for climb, while the other was not. The result was a catastrophic imbalance in lift. Inside the cockpit, the crew had no warning of the slat retraction. The DC-10 systems did not alert them to the damage, and the instrumentation, disrupted by the electrical severing, failed to provide accurate information. The pilots were flying blind to the true condition of the aircraft. They did what training had taught them, compensate for an engine failure. But this was not an engine failure in the traditional sense. It was a fundamental structural imbalance, one that no amount of skill could overcome. The roll became uncontrollable, and within seconds, the aircraft was doomed. The NTSB's final report, released months later, was a scathing indictment not only of American Airlines maintenance practices, but also of regulatory oversight. The shortcut method of removing engines had been used by multiple airlines, and inspectors had failed to catch its dangers. The tragedy of Flight 191 was not the fault of a single mechanic or a single decision, but the culmination of systemic complacency in the pursuit of efficiency. Public reaction to the findings was swift and furious. Families of victims demanded accountability. The DC-10 itself came under intense scrutiny. Within days of the accident, the Federal Aviation Administration grounded all DC-10s operating in the United States, and international aviation authorities followed suit. It was the first time an entire fleet of a major commercial aircraft had been suspended from service. Airlines scrambled to adjust schedules, passengers canceled flights, and the DC-10's reputation suffered a blow from which it would never fully recover. McDonnell Douglas defended its design, pointing out that the maintenance shortcut was never part of its approved procedure. Yet the public saw the DC-10 as unsafe, and headlines worldwide questioned whether it was a fundamentally flawed aircraft. For weeks, the grounding dragged on, while inspectors re-examined every DC-10 in service. Eventually, modifications were ordered, maintenance procedures were strictly revised, and the aircraft was cleared to fly again. But for many, the trust had been broken. Meanwhile, the families of the victims endured unimaginable grief. Lawsuits were filed against American Airlines, McDonnell Douglas, and the FAA itself. Memorial services were held across the country, each one a heartbreaking reminder of the 273 lives lost in a matter of seconds. Among the dead were entire families, business executives, and vacationers simply looking forward to a weekend in California. Every name told a story, and every story ended abruptly on that spring afternoon in Chicago. The legacy of Flight 191 rippled far beyond its immediate aftermath. For the aviation industry, it was a wake-up call. Maintenance procedures would never again be allowed to deviate so dangerously from manufacturer instructions. Oversight was strengthened, and airlines were forced to balance efficiency with safety in a way they had too often neglected. Pilots, too, studied the accident closely, learning how hidden failures could cascade into catastrophe. Safety systems were upgraded, warning instruments refined, and training adjusted to recognize more complex failure scenarios. For the public, Flight 191 became a symbol of both the fragility and resilience of air travel. While the crash shook confidence, it also spurred reforms that ultimately made flying safer. Each regulation rewritten, each inspection tightened, carried with it the memory of those who boarded Flight 191 expecting only a routine journey. Their loss ensured that future passengers would face a lower risk of sharing their fate. In the years that followed, the shadow of Flight 191 loomed over the aviation industry. For survivors' families, time did little to erase the pain. Memorials were erected, names etched into stone, and every anniversary brought renewed sorrow. In Des Plaines, near the crash site, a memorial garden now stands, filled with trees and flowers, a living tribute to the lives lost. It is a place of silence and remembrance, where the roar of airplanes overhead is both haunting and symbolic. For McDonnell Douglas, the damage to its reputation was lasting. Though the DC-10 eventually returned to service, airlines and passengers never fully trusted it again. The aircraft became infamous in the public imagination, often portrayed as dangerous despite years of relatively safe operation after modifications. It was a lesson that in aviation, perception can be as important as reality. Trust, once broken, is not easily repaired. American Airlines, too, faced enormous consequences. Lawsuits cost the company hundreds of millions of dollars, but the greater cost was moral. Their maintenance shortcuts had contributed directly to the disaster. In response, American and other carriers completely overhauled their maintenance practices. Shortcuts were abandoned, inspections became more rigorous, and compliance with manufacturer guidelines became non-negotiable. The culture of getting the job done faster shifted toward getting the job done safer. The FAA, under intense scrutiny, strengthened its oversight. Regulators learned that it was not enough to assume airlines were following approved procedures. Inspections became more thorough, and loopholes that had allowed unsafe practices to go unnoticed were closed. The grounding of the DC-10, while controversial at the time, was later seen as a necessary show of strength. proof that safety would always come before profit or convenience. For pilots, Flight 191 became a case study in the classroom. Training programs began to emphasize the dangers of compound failures, not just simple engine loss, but cascading system damage that could rob crews of the tools they needed to save their aircraft. Flight simulators were updated to include more complex emergency scenarios, ensuring that future crews would be better prepared. Though the men in the cockpit of Flight 191 never had a chance, their tragedy provided vital lessons for those who followed. As decades passed, air travel grew dramatically safer. Fatal accidents became rarer, thanks in part to reforms triggered by Flight 191. Each time a pilot corrected an error using new training, each time a mechanic double-checked a repair instead of rushing through it, the legacy of those lost passengers echoed. Their deaths were not in vain. They reshaped an industry. Yet even with all the progress, the story of Flight 191 remains chilling. It is not just a tale of mechanical failure or corporate negligence. It is a reminder of how small cracks, both literal and metaphorical, can lead to catastrophe if ignored. A forklift slightly misaligned, a shortcut tolerated, an inspector looking the other way. Each seems minor in isolation. Together, they can change history in an instant. Today, when travelers pass through O'Hare Airport, few realize that just beyond the runways lies the scar of America's worst single-plane aviation disaster. The ground has long since been cleared, grass regrown, but memory lingers. To those who remember, May 25, 1979 will always be a date etched in sorrow. As the sun sets over Chicago, one can imagine the silhouette of a wide-body jet climbing into the sky, its passengers unaware of the fate awaiting them. Flight 191 reminds us that behind every safety measure, every regulation, and every inspection lies a story written in human lives. The victims of that day will never return, but their legacy endures every time a jetliner takes off and lands safely. In the end, that is the only fitting tribute, to ensure that their story is never forgotten, and their sacrifice continues to protect those who follow.